Geography is a subject that's really funny to talk about. See, on the one hand, 90% of people are going to zone out almost immediately. It's real hard to keep people into the subject of talking about land and stuff. But if you're into it, anything geographical just hooks you. And when you're talking about fake geography, for some reason it's a whole lot more interesting to people. It's like that Place America, Place Japan meme, but taken to a whole other level. No one wants to hear about Greenland's glaciers, but change Greenland to Hoth and suddenly it's a different story. So with my justification for being publicly boring out of the way, the Empire of Man. It's a fantasy nation, it's styled after a real one, and it of course contains geography. So why don't we talk about it a little bit? Something I've said is great about fantasy is that the smaller scale means that it can give more appreciation to stuff like distances between places and landmarks, and I think that's shown perfectly with the various provinces of the Empire of Man. They all come across as unique places with their own differing cultures. We've got the heartland of Talabecland, heavily forested and militarized, Reikland, the cosmopolitan center of the realm, and the various provinces on the border that are differing levels of horrible for all sorts of fun reasons. So join me as we take a journey across the Empire of Man and see the different places that make it up. It may be faith, steel, and gunpowder that make it great, but it turns out you need a whole lot of infrastructure, land, and people to do anything with those things. Speaking of the Empire's provinces, though, they've probably not got the most nutritious of meals for people. Certainly not in Stirland, at least. But if you'd like some nutritious meals unlike them, you can do no better than Factor, the sponsor of this video. What is Factor? Well, I'll just cut straight to the point for you. Factor makes the finest of chef-crafted and dietitian-approved meals that are always fresh and never frozen, and they deliver them right to your front door. You ever stress out about having to go to the grocery store at the end of a long day and then have to cook everything on top of it? Well, no longer, because Factor is sent straight to your door and heats up in just 2 minutes. And even better, they're good for you. Instead of some fast food restaurant that's gonna bloat your waistline like Kirby inhaling a whole feast, Factor meals are made with your health in mind. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. You don't have to leave your house. You see me sitting at my table enjoying some Factor? The extent of my trip for this was walking to my fridge to grab the food and then to my microwave to heat it up. That's like a 2.5 minute affair, 2 of which were spent heating the food up. And because I know that everyone's always got money on their mind, I've got some savings from me to you. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50pancreas to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50pancreas at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. For food this good at those prices, there's no reason not to get some Factor, so use my code with the link in the description and pinned comment to make your eating experience better and easier than ever before. Now then, time to learn among other things why Stirlanders are subhuman. We'll start with the political heartland of the Empire, Reikland. Reikland is like the geographical version of a main character. Before any significant human presence, the elves had a small town in what would later become Altdorf known as Corva Nath. The dwarfs believed they detected magic coming from it before, showing it's always been a hotbed for activity. And of course, a slightly important man known as Sigmar Unberogen was born in that area. Like I said, main character of the province. The history of Reikland has been relatively peaceful, all things considered. When Altdorf was still called Reikdorf, it was attacked by Nagash, and of course, as with all imperial provinces, it was attacked by both the Skaven and the Undead during their respective Great Wars, but by the standards of Warhammer, it's pretty chill. Usually there's warnings that things are going downhill in the form of some of the more outlying provinces being sacked first. By all means, its position is incredibly secure. To the east and north lies the rest of the Empire that Chaos and the vampires have to chew through first before getting to the heart. To the west and south lay the Grey Mountains and its dwarf inhabitants, the Wood Elves, and Bretonnia, all of which behave mostly peacefully with the Empire. Not always, by any means, but more often than not. Reikland has always been important for a variety of reasons, even beyond having main character syndrome. Being the birth province of Sigmar, even ignoring the plot armor it somehow received from that, means that the cult of Sigmar is incredibly prominent there. In a mirror of Middenland, Reikland tends to look down on Ulrich worship as something almost savage and primitive. Other gods don't really get this treatment, and it's incredibly ironic since Sigmar was a diehard Ulrican, but what are you gonna do? More geographically speaking, it also has approximately every single natural resource one could possibly want. To the southwest, the Grey Mountains provide iron, gold, gems, and more, allowing for both wealth and the fueling of the province's war machine. To the northeast, the Reichwald forest dominates the majority of the province, allowing for trapping, hunting, and of course woodcutting, the last of which is especially important as the Empire begins to enter the Industrial Revolution. And in the middle of those two things is the Vorbergland, a comparatively small but still vast stretch of fertile land that provides everything from farming to cattle raising and even vineyards. And of course the River Reich, providing access to both fishing and the lucrative trade from Marienburg. If there was ever a province of the Empire that could be described as fully self-sustaining, it would be Reikland. As a bonus, the Drakwald is relatively thin compared to the other provinces, meaning there's less than 1 million beastmen per square mile to worry about. They're still there, because that fact about you never being more than 8 feet from a spider also applies to beastmen, but it's not as bad as the other provinces sometimes get. The people of Reikland are proud of their province, believing it to easily be the best in the Empire, and while I'm certainly feeding Reiklander arrogance, they've got some reason to believe this. The god of your empire being born there, combined with how prosperous and resource-rich it is in pretty much every way, means that Reiklanders are gifted with the closest thing to easy mode you have as a human in Warhammer. Plus, as far as safety goes, it's a far cry from Total War, where Karl Franz spends half the game in a panic attack as every single faction in the game beelines it towards Altdorf. Their pride extends in good and bad directions. In the good, joining the army is something actually done for patriotic reasons, from the lowly peasants to the bluest of blooded nobles. They see it as their duty to defend their empire and its lesser provinces and do right by Sigmar's name, so arrogant or not, Reiklanders will at least attempt to put their money where their mouth is. And in the Warhammer world, that sort of nationalism isn't too often used to invade random human nations, but rather defend everyone from chaos and more. The Empire aren't those Germans, remember, they're the floppy hat ones. On the other hand, a Reiklander bragging about how everyone in the province is more attractive than elsewhere in the Empire is more than a little bit grating, and they can be seen as soft by the fact that the safety of Reikland means they're never truly tested compared to the outlying provinces. Not helping this is that as a very cosmopolitan province, social graces and politics are very important, as well as fashion. So when some Reiklander merchant is talking about how dreadful this season's floppy hats are to a Nordlander who's had to deal with 3 Norscan raids this week, they can come across as a bit tone-deaf. Reikland is feudalistic as with the rest of the Empire, but is showing the most obvious signs of turning into a more modern state as the Empire progresses. The Grand Prince of Reikland, who incidentally is also the Emperor, has to have his edicts outside of a few select powers ratified by the Reikland Diet, 10 lords who each have a different field to specialize in. Though they may be Prince and Emperor, they have a lot of stuff to work through to get their edicts in, so next time you complain about the window tax, consider it wasn't Karl's fault entirely. That wasn't an emergency tax, other people thought it was a good idea to push through too. Reikland overall is a bustling province that's only been growing in population, economic status, and more. With Altdorf being the capital and the source of much of the Empire's most prestigious institutions, as well as its bounty of natural resources, there's always something going on to give the Reiklanders more fuel for their egos. Though not perfect, since nothing is, it's probably your best bet in the Empire for something resembling a modern lifestyle. Let's move on to the next one now. Middenland. It's in the middle. I'm very observant. If Reikland is the main character province, Middenland is the rival that can never quite win. It comes close and sometimes has a leg up, but can never quite achieve total victory. In ancient times, it was the land of the Tetujans tribe, subsumed into Sigmar's empire after he walked into the sacred flame of Ulrich and came out howling like a wolf before caving in some dude's head. He kind of deserved it, mostly, kind of, a little. Don't worry. Ever since then, it's been the bastion of Ulrican faith within the Empire. Though the northern provinces of the Empire tends more towards Ulric worship in general, in Middenland it is the heart of the faith where the Ulric resides and his presence is most felt. Across the province, when winter falls, his wolves prowl the lands, a sign of his protection, wrath, and displeasure all at once, depending on how hungry they are. Middenland is an interesting province in a lot of ways. Middenheim, the main city, is of course an important location for the faith, but also both a political hotspot and still a fairly cosmopolitan city. It's not Altdorf or Nuln where they just throw magic and gunpowder at the wall for funsies, but it's by no means a backwater. Its walls are high, its people hardy, and its position secure against the enemies of man. Cannons surround the entire thing in all directions, because no matter where danger comes from, the Middenlanders will answer the challenge. Technologically, it granted is not as advanced as its more southern neighbors for a few different reasons. One is that outside of the major cities, the entire damn thing is a dark and ominous forest. There's only so much room for development and industry to prosper, and the Drakwald is not the kind of forest that takes kindly to uninvited guests. It's mostly been cleared in the areas around Middenheim and some other towns, but aside from that and the highways across the province, it is nothing but trees for miles on end. The other reason is that as the home of the ancient god of war Ulrich, they tend to look down on those fancy pants inventions of warfare for little whittle babies. This can range from a disdain for gunpowder beyond defensive positions like Middenheim's walls, to thinking that anyone whose battle plan goes beyond charging headfirst into the enemy is a stupid idiot loser bitch. Still though, Ulrican war priests are savage berserkers that can rip through even warriors of chaos when the time calls, and the army as a whole is one of the most well-trained in the entire empire. Middenland knows war and they know it well, and every instance of a Middenland army being destroyed because they thought with their biceps is matched by an instance where the almost insane bravery of a Middenlander force force tore through the enemy like a hurricane. And like I briefly mentioned, Middenlanders are smart enough to make sure the forest doesn't overtake the highways. It connects them to the rest of the Empire and the wider world, and without it, they'd be cut off. This is important for trade, diplomacy, and all those boring statescraft reasons, but it's also important for military movement, because the population of this province is about 100 beastmen per person. Their rampaging hordes are a regular thing here, with some towns being built and rebuilt multiple times a decade. The town of Grimmenhagen in particular sucks to live in, because it sits in the middle of not only a strategic route across the province, but also in the middle of a beast path. Every 5 minutes this shithole gets torn down, and every 10 minutes it gets put right back up. In addition to the more feral beastmen, there's also a group of them known as the Red Crown that are far more dangerously organized. They worship Tzeentch and Chaos Undivided, and are actually happy to work alongside human followers of Chaos, giving them a cunning streak rarely seen in the animals. Slightly offsetting this is that the normal beastmen in the area do not appreciate the way Red Crown does stuff, and they tend to fight to the death whenever they meet. And of course, Kazrak One-Eye and Boris Todbringer go at it every time one of them blinks their solitary eye. Economically speaking, Middenland is hardly breaking records, but it does well enough for itself. The soil isn't great for growing, but just enough crops are produced to feed everyone and keep a minor surplus. Livestock is rarely seen, both because of the aforementioned soil problems, as well as the fact that those are far too tempting a target for beastmen and greenskin raiders. Making up for this is a fairly prosperous fur trade. Not quite everything in the Drakwald is beastmen, and the furs and meats of the animals within constitute a large portion of Middenheim's exports and trade goods. Aside from that, it's a whole lot of lumber. If your province is 90% tree, you're gonna have a whole lot of wood for sale. The Middle Mountains also provide a small but steady stream of iron, silver, and gold, giving it a little bit of a boost in that area as well. There's also something and someone real old and dwarfy up there, but that's a story for a different time. Although relatedly, Middenland is home to all sorts of fun ruins. A small amount of them date back to the elven colonies in the area prior to the War of the Beard, and many more stand as grim monuments to the wars the Empire has fought against both outside threats and between its various provinces. Politically, the state is the chief rival to Reikland, with this ranging from a friendly competition to almost blood feud levels depending on the year. The province essentially has 2 votes in who becomes emperor because of the cult of Ulrich, but since Reikland functionally has 4 with the cult of Sigmar, it leads to all sorts of squabbling over how fair that is. It's also the province many believe is most likely to outright secede from the Empire, and in many cases this has only been stopped by the fact that Middenland is usually too busy dealing with beastmen to commit. Nevertheless, the province is ultimately loyal, and with some convincing, the rulers of it will eventually accept the rule of the current emperor, even if they are a weakling Sigmarite. And if there's one takeaway, it's that Middenland was the site of the last meaningful stand against chaos during the end times. Sure, the Oak of Ages fell last, and sure, the last few important people retreated to Sylvania and the goddamn Moot of all places, but it was Middenland and Middenheim where the last true resistance and ritual to save the world took place. Middenlanders may be called stubborn, brash, and outright savage by the rest of the Empire, but they always go down swinging in defense of it, and you can be damn sure they'll take plenty of people with them when they do. Moving up north, we have Nordland, very creatively named, truly. Nordlanders come from the Utones tribe, and were only fully conquered hundreds of years into the Empire's history. Now, looking at this map, you will notice that Nordland is quite close to Norska. This has resulted in Nordland being raided by them perhaps more than any other Imperial province, at least when the Norskins are feeling like taking the longboat for a spin. You can actually gauge how much of a threat chaos is in any given moment by looking at how often Nordland is being raided. Once a month, that's just business as usual. Don't gotta worry about nothing. Twice a month, then that could be a sign of things getting bad, but it could also just be that there's nothing better to do in Norska and they're bored. Once you get to weekly raids, it's time to start worrying, because there's likely some enterprising warlord on the up and coming looking to attack the Empire. Any more than that, and it's probably ever-chosen season, so good luck everyone. To partially offset this, the Imperial Navy is largely based in this province. It used to be based in Marienburg, but then Marienburg seceded, so now Nordland is the next best spot. It also has a robust fishing industry by virtue of being one of the only imperial provinces bordering the sea proper. Culturally, Nordland is oftentimes considered to be the odd man out in the Empire. By virtue of being conquered, it doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the unification of the land. Additionally, there's no small amount of Norskin blood that can be found within Nordlanders. When other Imperials are feeling positive, this has given the province a reputation for producing simple but honest folk who are blunt to a fault and will always give the most honest opinion possible. Nordlanders are even renowned for their storytelling. A tradition that was once all about bragging rights evolved into telling the best story possible around an inn's hearth, and every province in the Empire will happily house a Nordlander if it looks like they've got the perfect ghost story to tell around a campfire. At worst, however, Nordlanders are looked upon with disdain and suspicion. The Norskin blood has led other Imperials to fear that Nordlanders might only be a stone's throw away from the followers of chaos that plague their lands. In some ways, this is partially true, since no small amount of Norskins who've wanted for a better life have left for Nordland's shores. These are the southern Norskins who actually do things other than murder and pillage, so this suspicion isn't terribly well founded, but it still remains. In a more mundane way, a common sentiment is that the honesty of the Nordlanders is because they're too stupid to come up with a lie. This has actually been taken advantage of by Nordland merchants, which is a wonderful thing to read about. They'll pretend to be too stupid to understand the sly dealings of another merchant, and at their most blunt, they'll just shout out loud at the top of their lungs the final price of whatever they're buying or selling. Turns out your average person will be caught off guard by the half-Viking tradesmen loudly proclaiming what your prices are, and many will be too scared to haggle any further. Nordlanders in the military have a bit of a mixed reputation. Their Norskin influence has oftentimes made them make use of berserker tactics. One battle had a rank of Nordland pikemen become so anxious to fight they charged into enemy lines without being given an order, leaving the flank exposed and themselves isolated. This has led to the sentiment that Nordlanders should be treated like a hound on a leash, and if you don't keep them close, they'll run off and charge into battle without a second thought. Between this and the general suspicion they can accrue, however, Nordlanders have made an effort to be seen as the most vocally loyal of the Emperor's subjects. They know in the realm of public opinion the cards are stacked against them a bit, and they as such have dedicated themselves to Sigmar and especially Ulrich, arguably even more so than the Middenlanders. And of course, the flip side of Berserker Fury is that no one really worries that Nordlanders are going to break and run in the middle of a crucial moment in battle. Or if they do, it'll be towards the enemy and not away from them. Suicidal bravery, after all, is equal parts suicidal and brave. Economically, aside from fishing, they also have a thriving fur trade. Even provinces especially renowned for hunting, like Hochland and Talabecland, begrudgingly admit that Nordland hunters know what they're doing. Much like Middenland, they also have a timber industry, but unlike Middenland, they aren't quite as good as dealing with the beastmen within their province. There's a roughly equal amount, but they aren't as good at getting rid of them as Todbringer is. Unless accompanied by an entire regiment of soldiers, lumberjacks will rarely enter a forest to cut it down, leading to the economy suffering somewhat in recent times. To balance that out, however, the capital of Slaysenflite has become a hotspot for all sorts of merchant activity, and while not quite rivaling Marienburg, it certainly has plenty of room for profit to be made. Its location bordering the Sea of Claws means Kislevites from Erengrad sail nearby to sell their wares and restock, and even dwarfs and elves can be found plying their trade in addition to nobles from Middenland. The province is in some ways hurting economically, but it's far from the poorest region in the realm and does have plenty still going for it. It strikes me more as being in a slump rather than being a backwater mud pit, mentioning no Stirlands, I mean names. There's also the slight issue that much of Nordland doesn't really belong to Nordland. In the political sense, if you listen to all the different claims the Elector technically has, then the entire northern half of the Empire belongs to Nordland. No one really listens to them on that front, though. For some more interesting ways, however, Nordland is also home to Lower Lorne Forest, an enclave of wood elves. That's not as bad for them as you might think, though, because these aren't the crazy Athel Loren kind of wood elves. They'll certainly kill you if you trespass on their sacred grounds, but unlike the rest of the Azrai, they'll at least politely tell you to leave first, rather than immediately sicking dryads on you for getting lost. They frequently get into disputes with Nordland over what territory who's allowed in, but they also trade with the humans regularly. They'll even send delegates to Middenland to help them settle these disputes before the arrows start flying, because they genuinely just want to live in peace. Lower Lorne Forest was even a major reason as to why the Empire didn't conquer Nordland for centuries. The rest of the Empire feared provoking the wrath of the elves. There's plenty of arguments to be had, but usually they just stay at that level rather than escalating to full-blown warfare. Overall, Nordland isn't the most bustling of provinces, and in plenty of regions it can certainly be dangerous. But for one that wants opportunity on the high seas, or one that really wants to kill some Norskins, the province can be a decent place to settle down. And if in spite of the danger you just want a place to spend your nights drinking and telling stories, there's no better place for you than here. And if you're like me and want to try your hand at getting the elf of your dreams, there's no better spot in the Empire to get rejected than here. They just let you down instead of killing you for asking. To the right of Nordland, we have Ostland, once again so incredibly uncreative in the naming. Eastland, that's the name in English. It's also something that you really gotta add the word Warhammer into the search before you look it up, because if you're here and looking for more information after this video, you're presumably looking to learn about the fantasy province of Ostland. Not, as it were, Reichskommissariat Ostland, which is where a different kind of monster tried to make its home for a bit. Ostland can be best summarized by a common phrase they have up in the north there. A wolf at the door is still a wolf. It's the other imperial province that directly borders the Sea of Claws, but it also borders Kislev. This has led to Ostland usually being the first province of the Empire that Chaos bulldozes through after whatever Ever-Chosen is up this time makes it through Kislev. Ostland in general is one of the poorest and most sparsely inhabited provinces in the Empire. Covering almost the entire thing is the Forest of Shadows. If the Drakwald sucks because it's 90% beastmen, the Forest of Shadows sucks because the beastmen are the least problematic thing in there. Mysterious forces are at work, some of them far older than even the Empire, and as a whole it strikes me as a sort of off-brand Athel Loren, only without the wood elves to occasionally curtail the forest spirit's worst impulses. Woodsmen tell stories of it changing the path behind them when they look away, and if you delve a bit too deep, there's decent odds you aren't coming out. Causing some, but not all of these forest shenanigans is that it tends to have spots that are damaged by chaos because it's regularly invaded by chaos. What little economy there is either hunting, foresting, or farming, none of which are terribly profitable or safe. All this being said, it tends to be less pathetic and more the vibe of the Imperial Guard. Grimdark and miserable, but in a bravely hold the line no matter what kind of way. Ostland has close ties to Kislev, arguably closer than the ties they have with the rest of the Empire, and in turn Ostland's populace is one of the few provinces within the Empire that Kislevites don't automatically write off as weak southerners. The people there worship mostly Tal, Raya, and Ulrich, and their experience with the forest has turned them into a hardy first wall that Chaos has to break through if they want to get to the rest of the Empire. Few in number but great in spirit, much like their Kislevite neighbors, an Ostlander will draw their weight in blood from any invaders before they finally fall. Of course, they're still the butt of plenty jokes amongst the Empire. As a result of such a low population, a lot of the town and the province largely consist of one really big extended family, so plenty of jokes about inbred Ostlanders make the rounds around the Empire. In spite of being an impoverished and made fun of province, Ostland stands proud. They respect their families, are good honest folk, and yeah, while there's probably no small amount of inbreeding, at least they're decent people who hold the line. I would never want to live there, but I can respect the people who do their role in defending the Empire of Man. Moving back west, we have Hochland. In the running theme of most of the Empire's provinces, Hochland is 90% forest, and those forests are 90% beastmen. Hochland is a bit all over the place. It's a land of a lot of sharply contrasting features. The province has a rather low population, but despite the forest, compared to places like Ostland and Nordland, it's fairly secure. Yeah, the beastmen are everywhere, but there's not much in the way of outside threats. The river Talabecland runs through the province and provides trade and fishing with the rest of the Empire, though the province isn't terribly wealthy, and while it's self-sufficient, anything beyond the basics needs to be imported. Its military is small and not suited for open combat, and yet it's most effective in the Empire in its element of forested battles and hit-and-run tactics. It has the Hochland long rifle, which is an actual honest-to-God rifle. The gun has rifling in its barreling, and it's accurate in a way no musket ever could be. Unfortunately, the province has basically no industry, and the rifles are usually handmade by experts, which is why the Empire hasn't single-handedly conquered Norska with modern firearms yet. For all the downsides I've just mentioned, it's a pleasant enough province. Though the population is fairly low, it's well-traveled by virtue of being smack dab in the middle of the Empire, and its people are renowned for being nice. No catch here, they're just nice and fun people to be around. Some people joke that it's naivety rather than actual kindness or loyalty to the Empire, but if that's the worst thing to say about Hochlanders, I'd say it's pretty high marks. It actually has a small magic school in the capital of Hergig, and many different faiths have a strong presence to the point that I'm not really sure you could call worship of one god the most prominent over the others. Everything about it makes me think of a more rustic version of Reikland. Not as trendy, not as urban, but a decent enough place to live. Also, the final Gotrek and Felix book begins with a group of Imperial State troopers shouting out "Blood of Hochland," and for some reason that sticks in my mind. It's just a sort of nice mental image. The world's ending, chaos is rampant, but these men were still doing their best to protect the refugees with them and give chaos one last black eye on the way out. I guess since there's not much I can think to say about it, I'll tell you the full and official name of the Hochland Long Rifle. Created by a man named Leon Todmeister, the full name is known as Leon Todmeister's fantabulously far-reaching harquebus of unforeseeable and unperceived bereavement. How come fantasy has all the fun names like that for inventions despite not being a sci-fi setting? If the Landspeeder is called that because it was discovered by Arkan Land, then why didn't he commit? Rename the thing to Arkan Land's wonder-mazing flying box of rapid destruction and domination or something like that. Have fun with it. Our next stop is Ostermark. You know how I said Ostland is grimdark and defiant and not pathetic despite being a pretty miserable place to live? Ostermark is the pathetic mess of a place to live. How about we start with what the good things about this place are, because there's not much I have to say, and most of it isn't positive. The current Elector Count Wolfram Hertwig said that it's like a mini-empire, with all the towns banding together to make up the larger whole of Ostermark. I know that does just kind of make it sound like any other province, because that's how governments work, but in this case it's in a fairly self-sufficient kind of way. The land it's on is also incredibly fertile and has access to plenty of resources, allowing it to grow large amounts of crops and helping it be self-sufficient. The province also breeds strong horses, giving some of the Empire's many knightly orders access to the finest steeds a man can find. And they have a pretty accepting attitude when it comes to death, viewing it as simply part of life. This concludes the positives I have to say about Ostermark. Now, where to even begin with the negatives? Well, how about we start slow? The place is incredibly mismanaged. The government isn't quite so bad as to produce an endless stream of Kalidor 2s, but some of the people and nobles in charge sometimes seem to forget basic concepts, like math, or not building your city next to a warpstone deposit. There are almost no proper cities within Ostermark, because of both the mismanagement and the constant threats. Speaking of, those threats are the main reason Ostermark sucks. Also bordering Kislev means that chaos is never too far away, but unlike Ostland, where they're always buddies, it seems that Ostermark switches between best friends and hated enemies with their Slavic neighbors. So the marauders pouring in from the north could be angry Vikings or angry Eastern Europeans. Fun either way. Alternatively, the World's Edge Mountains are right to the east, meaning greenskins and all the monsters they have in their army roster like to pay a visit every now and again too. At one point this included Grimgor Ironhide, who is a visitor you'd never want to see on your front door. Alternatively, if you go south, you hit the province of Sylvania, and while Ostermark isn't usually the main focus of an undead assault, it's still bordering zombie land. The east is the only safe direction, and I mean that very literally. Though not as much as with Under Altdorf or Under Middenheim, you can almost surely find plenty of Skaven beneath the province, and I shit you not, the sky isn't safe either. Because the old capital of Ostermark was the city of Mordheim, before a warpstone comet crashed into the thing and wiped it off the map. After that it was burned down by Magnus the Pious, and then because of some weird time distortion crap, it was super burned down by Gotrek and Felix, because of course it was the two of them. And in Total Warhammer, Drake has set up shop there as well within the Griffin Woods, which are a terrible place to be near, even ignoring the Dryad. This is an awful place to live. Don't go there. If there's historical precedent that Grimgor Ironhide likes to visit the area, you want to be as far away as possible. The people are also dour and grim, to the point that the running joke in the rest of the Empire about Ostermarkers is that you should never ask them about their day, lest you get the most depressing tirade you'll ever hear in response. I don't have a lot to say about Ostermark other than that you should never go to Ostermark. Let's go somewhere happier. Talabecland. These guys love Tal. They love him so much they named the province after him. Sure enough, we have another nature-preserved province, although it's slightly less awful than the rest of the similar provinces. It's one of the largest ones by far, stretching hundreds of miles from east to west and being right in the middle of the Empire. It controls most of the rivers Talabek and Stir, giving it access to some pretty good trading deals once they come down the river from Altdorf. Aside from the obvious parts of hunting and foresting being common occupations in Talabecland, the main two jobs you can expect to find are merchants and soldiers. A highly militarized province, Talabeclanders help guard the winding roads that stretch through their forest from beastmen, greenskins, and common bandits. It's that last part that shows how their forest isn't too bad, because if normal human bandits have a chance to set up shop, then all things considered, it can't be that dangerous a place. We're down to only like 2 beastmen a person here. That's pretty good numbers. But since they have to guard so much of the Empire's trade by virtue of most of it passing through the region at some point, the military is always on standby to respond to threats and the like. Plus, being in the center of the Empire means outside threats have to chew through the dumpster fires like Ostermark first, giving Talabecland the time and energy needed to muster a full army, rather than 3 starving dudes who are probably all brother cousins. Talabeclanders are a practical folk in all ways of life. At the worst stereotypes of the rest of the Empire, they're stupid and barbaric folk who wear leaves instead of clothing, and have a habit of being overly argumentative. But when other Imperials are feeling kind in their views, they're just honest and hard-working folk that eschew creature comforts for practical things. Families would take their children out to learn important hunting and survival lessons, because even though it's relatively safe, the forest is still dangerous. There may not be many beastmen, but there are still bears. Glory is for the entire army and unit, not just the individual, so they'll frequently downplay anything they did in battle. After all, a single man does not an army make, so while they're pretty plain folk, they're also humble and won't brag at you for hours on end. Keeps and fortified inns dot the roads across the province, and of course Talabheim must be mentioned. One of the largest cities in the Empire, it's built in the shallow crater of a meteor impact. The impact produced massive natural walls around the city that form its chief defenses, and because there's only one way through the city, it's essentially impregnable to outside assault. Talabecland unfortunately has one major black mark on its history, and that's how it technically started the Age of 3 Emperors that lasted for 1,000 years. To be fair, it wasn't strictly speaking their fault. Not entirely, at least. The emperor elected in the year 1359 was accused by Elector Countess Ottilia of Talabecland of being a sham. She said that he had bribed and cheated his way into the position, and to be fair to her, this was absolutely true. The cult of Sigmar had the Elector of Stirland firmly in its pockets, and combined with their 3 electoral votes meant that it was pretty easy to argue she was screwed out of the position of empress. With the backing of the cult of Ulrich, who convinced her to take decisive action, she declared war on the province of Stirland for the right to become emperor, and she won decisively. However, 3 arguments were made to still refuse giving her the crown. The first and most honest, if unspoken one, was that the cult of Sigmar wasn't going to let their power grab go to waste just like that. The second and halfway honest one was that she did still technically lose the election, even though it was rigged, so shut up and go back home to Talabecland already. And the third reason, which admittedly wasn't the main reason, but they still did justify refusing her the crown with it, was to basically point at her and just go woman moment. As a woman, she was unfit to rule. This was not brought up when she became countess, this was not brought up again later, but in that moment the classic defense of no girls allowed was deployed. She declared herself empress anyway in response, so now there's 2 emperors, and then 200 years later Middenland got in on the fun, and then there was 3. So shame about that little bit of a black mark to Talabecland, because overall it is a pretty nice province to be in. Almost done with the official provinces, and we have come to Averland next. Averland is a fertile province with very little in the way of forest, a rarity in the Empire. It isn't quite as fertile as Ostermark, but it makes up for that by not being Ostermark. Every few years the rivers flood a bit higher, and the Averlanders within it just accept the resulting flooding as the price they pay for the nice place they live in. In general, the closer you get to Nuln, the more classically noble the nobility gets. Though cattle ranching is a common thing for the nobles to be invested in, those families tend to hire out others to do all the work for them, with the more rural nobles taking pride in doing it themselves. This means 2 important things for you to know. 1, it is technically possible, given the presence of flintlock pistols, to have an entirely lore-accurate cowboy army in Warhammer fantasy. And 2 is that a common joke about Averlanders is that they plow their cattle as often as they plow their fields. See, that's why fantasy is just better than 40k. Your average Hiveworlder doesn't know jack about other planets, while in fantasy, Reiklanders joke about how Averlanders fuck cows. That's quality world building. Politically, Averland is internally almost more similar to the elves than the Empire. Instead of a nice, honest civil war over who gets to be the next Elector Count, Averlanders instead have lengthy and elaborate political contests to determine who wins. Who's backing who changes at the drop of a hat, and it's a messy affair to any outsiders looking in. Probably not helping this is that Averlanders tend to be a bit eccentric, or if we're not trying to be politically correct, batshit insane. They largely resent this sentiment, but then again they also put Marius Leitdorf in charge, who was a madman. For once, this is meant very literally as well. He wasn't mad in the sense of, you just murdered thousands of people, you're insane, although he did ruthlessly crush the Halfling Rebellion. No, he would spend his time waging war against enemies that didn't actually exist. He thought they did, but they didn't. The people themselves are an honest and cheery folk, almost always speaking their mind and always appreciating a good time. When a visitor comes to their town, they're generous in paying for the drinks, and Averlanders must surely love the company of Nordlanders because they love nothing more than to hear a good story. The dwarfs actually love them too, because they've got a proper doughy sense of humor, don't beat around the bush, and happily share the ale. On the negative side of viewing an Averlander, they seem contradictory and prone to changing their minds at random. Averlanders can be very suspicious as well, although we're not at the worst province with that. We haven't gotten to Stirland yet. They're superstitious more in the ways that a Discord rot girl is, worrying about the signs and the stars and how that will somehow affect the quality of their mead. Astrology and that garbage, you know? The kind of superstition that doesn't lead to cults, but does lead to being lectured about the color of some rock or other nonsense. Militarily speaking, the people of Averland are the defensive experts of the Empire of Man. They have the dubious honor of having to guard none other than Blackfire Pass itself, where plenty of orcs come into the Empire Empire from the Badlands. The province was also ransacked by the forces of Gorbad Ironclaw once, and they are very determined to make sure that doesn't happen ever again. Since the people there have been known to enjoy the finer things in life, Averland uniforms are of the highest quality, at least when it comes to being flashy. They aren't necessarily better than other provinces' armor, but by God do they look more expensive. Their attitudes also extend to military life as well, but they highly resent anyone who implies their superstition leads to them fleeing the field of battle because that boulder over there looked like a bad sign or something. Overall, if you couldn't live in Reikland and wanted a peaceful life, Averland is probably where you'd want to live instead. Even living relatively near the orcs, it's fairly peaceful. They're friendly with the dwarfs, friendly with each other, friendly with outsiders, and it's the only place in the entire goddamn empire where you can almost certainly say there aren't any beastmen. For that reason alone, Averland is a great place. Oh, and they also used to hunt halflings for sport. Marius Leitdorf nearly brought it back after only a century of it being outlawed, and it was only Karl Franz reining him in that stopped him. So if you really don't like halflings, that's another reason to consider moving to Averland. Second to last of the provinces is Wissenland, a province of bustling industry and trade. This is where you go if you're an inventor. Mark Wahlberg aside, let's briefly talk about a province that once was, Stirland. Stirland doesn't really need much elaborating on. It used to be a province. Then Gorbad Ironclaw came through. Averland, like I said, sure got hit hard. Stirland got erased from the map. Its territory was split between Averland and Wissenland, and both provinces added some of its heraldry to their own as a sign of respect for the fallen. God, I've had Transformers on the brain recently. Back onto Wissenland now. Wissenland is similar to Reikland in that it also has a pretty wide variety of industries to trade with and accrue wealth from. From what was Stirland, it inherited some pretty fertile pastures, from everything to cattle to crops to wine. It also inherited some survivor's guilt for whatever reason. I mean, I get it, I'm no stranger to Catholic guilt, sometimes for no reason you just feel guilty. In the west, meanwhile, the land is garbage, but it does have access to the mountains where all sorts of riches can be found. Aside from the usual mining gold, it also supplies what's really the only thing worth mentioning in the province, the city of Nordland. Oh, and there's also a canal that goes all the way through the mountains to Tylea that operates year-round, which means the Empire somehow has an overland sea trading route with the Italians, although I suppose it's technically underland, isn't it? Wissenlanders can be depressing at times and are often seen similarly to Ostermarkers, a dour and sad bunch who are just a bit too obsessed with the gods. An ironic complaint for a fantasy setting, but I suppose in day-to-day life Sigmar doesn't make himself known too often. The presence of the engineering facilities in Nuln has naturally attracted a lot of dwarfs, to the point that people say that the dwarf way of speaking has turned Wissenlanders so short-spoken and quick to get to the point. Height joke. Sigmar worship is of course dominant, but Tal and Raya have a large presence, and the dwarfs are given temples to their own gods to worship, which was kind of the Wissenlanders. By contrast, the people who live in Nuln are far more up-to-date on the latest trends, and the city itself rivals Altdorf in many ways, in no small part because it once was the capital of the Empire. Grom the Paunch changed that, but it still is important. In fact, Nuln is actually an independent city-state, and to be frank with you, pretty much everything important about the province happens in Nuln, including Gotrek and Felix stories, to the surprise of no one. Nuln is the economic powerhouse of the Southern Empire, with trade routes all across the continent finding their way to the city. With the gunnery school in place there, you can always tell who's a foreigner. If someone ducks in cover every time they hear a cannon go off, they ain't from Nuln. It was pretty thoroughly wrecked by the Skaven, who were in turn wrecked by Gotrek and Felix, but it had recovered in large part over the coming years, just in time for the end of the world. Militarily, Wissenland doesn't have the best standing army, since apparently Nuln devours all the funding it could potentially use otherwise. As a result, the army is similar to Hochland of all places, in that it largely uses hit-and-run tactics. During the winter it gets very cold, and the people have to try and avoid starving to death or freezing to death like they're in Kislev. And if that sounds like I'm reaching for more to talk about, it's because I am. Wissenland is in large a fairly unremarkable province, only made noteworthy by the presence of one of the Empire's most important cities. Kind of like how Illinois is 90% corn and then suddenly you run into Chicago. That actually works pretty well, since Chicago isn't the capital of Illinois, but it sure as hell is the only place worth mentioning. Who gives a shit about Springfield? There's like 50 of those across the country. In that same vein, no one cares about Wissenberg, although you're probably more likely to get mugged in Chicago than even Nuln's seedier bits. And our final province is Stirland. It blows. Everything about it sucks. Ostermark at least is fairly tight-knit amongst itself, but Stirland just sucks ass. Allow me to tell you why. First off, most of the land is garbage. It's got dark marshes, dark forests, winding rivers that aren't nearly as prosperous as elsewhere in the Empire, and the land isn't great for crops either. While there are admittedly some fairly developed cities that trade with the dwarfs of Zufbar, the moment you leave those, it's nothing but backwater nothingness for miles and miles on end. For another reason the land sucks, it neighbors Sylvania. And unlike Ostermark, Stirland is directly in the path of any vampires that are gunning for Altdorf on a given day. During the Vampire Wars, it was ransacked and large swaths of land corrupted by dark magic, and as a result of this and living next to Sylvania, Stirlanders are intensely superstitious people. Unlike Averlanders, this is the paranoid kind of superstition. There was a Stirlander on a Marienburg merchant ship once who reportedly carried 16 lucky charms on him at any given moment. This paranoia, of course, also extends to a good majority of modern inventions the Empire has made. To give them as much credit as I possibly can, being superstitious when you're next to the home of the vampire counts is a pretty wise thing to be. But there's superstition of dark magic, and then there's distrusting a Reiklander who comes into town because he doesn't smell like shit. And I'm absolutely not kidding about that. There's a village in Stirland where children throw feces at travelers because they believe it drives off evil spirits. And they aren't throwing it at travelers because they think they're evil, they genuinely believe the act is helping protect the travelers from evil spirits. How do you want me to put a positive spin on that? Of course, to some extent, they also still dislike strangers, because who knows what they might bring. Doors are bolted the moment evening sets in, prayers and warding signs are thrown up at the slightest turn of the weather, and the entire province is honestly just sad. It is hard to not feel sad for these people, unless you recently had shit thrown on you. Probably not much pity left in you after that happens. At the very best, other Imperials view them as quaint people. Like if you visited a city that stopped culturally and technologically advancing during the Wild West and just stayed like that. At worst, they view them as I've described, a superstitious backwater dump. At least they don't have to worry about the inbreeding accusations, since Stirlanders keep remarkably accurate family trees, but you don't get credit for not being incestuous. They technically count as part of their province Sylvania, but no one ever goes there or functionally acknowledges this because Sylvania is vampire central and no one ever wants to go there. Militarily, Stirland is once again coming in at last place, because all it really does with what it calls an army is patrol the River Ster. An important job, I'll admit, but when the vampires get active again, their defense largely comes down to hoping Averland is ready to fight, because if not, they're screwed. As one final kick in the nuts from me to Stirland, they also hate halflings like Averland. They're bitter the land that became the Moot was sold to them. But Averland's hatred is kind of funny in a dark way. Like I imagine that Simpsons episode where Mr. Burns hunts everyone, only instead he's hunting Bilbo Baggins. But in Stirland they have children's parties where they make halfling piñatas and pretend all the treats inside it were stolen by the halfling. Then they beat it up until candy comes out, which they call the halfling giving them back, which is Jesus Christ, all kinds of messed up. Stirlanders deny that they occasionally get drunk and do this with actual halflings, which is, by the way, just straight up lynching people. And that sums up the official Imperial provinces, but there's a few more I'd like to briefly cover for a couple different reasons. First off, since it was just mentioned, the Moot. There's not too much to talk about here. It's the home of the halflings. It used to be mostly Stirland and a bit of Averland until the halfling chief baked the ruling emperor a really good meal, so he made it semi-autonomous. They also get a vote in who becomes emperor because they cooked good. Halflings in Warhammer are... how do I put this? You know how GW used to just quietly put something incredibly racist into Warhammer? Like, if you know anything about the Pygmies, you don't need me to explain what I'm talking about. Well, the halflings are written as if someone was incredibly racist against halflings. Like if someone read The Lord of the Rings and wanted to put Frodo through a wood chipper. They're almost all morbidly obese and just love stealing stuff. An elven merchant who lived there for a while mentioned how they were polite and cheerful folk, but they kept stealing his coins. They're so greedy that when Averland came in to build some roads to not only help troops move through the region, but bring better trade to the Moot, both of which would immensely help the halflings, they demanded massive payments of gold and cattle for the privilege of doing it. Which Averland for some reason put up with and paid, but then when a band of halflings started kidnapping builders when they were constructing a bridge over a river, the halfling elders said there was nothing they could do about it. Those particular halflings were allowed to kidnap construction workers, because they said the Averlanders could build roads, not bridges. Then Marius Leitdorf came in with the order to, and I quote, slaughter every one of the malodorous runts. Jesus Christ. And while Karl Franz did eventually stop him, it wasn't until after Leitdorf had sated his fury and the ogres hired to defend the halflings kidnapped entire families of them to bring back to the Mountains of Morn and cook for the ogres. So that's the Moot. It's just racism and genocide. Moving on from that, the Drakwald was a former province between Middenland and Nordland. It was pretty corrupt, was eventually worn down by greenskin and beastmen attacks, and the land was subsumed into Nordland and Middenland. There's not too much worth knowing about there. And finally, at the end of the road, Westerland. If you're feeling rude, you can call it the Wasteland, and if you're being honest, you can call it Marienburg, because that's the only thing of real interest there. In fact, here's the TLDR of 99% of the region. It's mostly swamp, there's a big road that connects the outlying villages, and there's a few areas in the south that have sheep herds. That's it. Let's talk about Marienburg. It was once another province in the Empire until it literally bought its independence. Ever since then, the city has been fully independent, and out of all government forms to take in Warhammer, it actually has a parliamentary democracy that's only kind of corrupt. In fact, it kind of invented democracy in Warhammer Fantasy and even coined the word. Aside from the sheep, though, Marienburg makes its name by being the single greatest trading port in the entire world, barring maybe Lothern. And despite my love for the elves, even I have to admit that it's a pretty big maybe. Sure, Iceland, the High Elf Navy commander, did kind of burn it down once, but there's a good reason the elves keep coming back to trade instead of trying to salt the land for the insolence of mankind. That reason being, if you have anything worthwhile to trade, you come to Marienburg. From Araby to Ulthuan, the Empire to Bretonnia, from Kislev and even Norska, do the traders come in to hawk their wares. Within Marienburg can be found pretty much anything imaginable if you look hard enough. You can even find some rather more interesting illegal things such as warpstone, although for that kind of stuff you're probably best going south to Sartosa. As for fun, drinking, gambling, trading, anything can be found in Marienburg. If you don't leave at least 3 different STIs, you haven't had a good trip. It also plays host to embassies from across the world, all of which are spying on each other, all of which Marienburg knows are spying on it, and all of whom are to some extent getting conned by Marienburgers into paying them for useless knowledge. Bretonnia would like to take it, the Empire would like to take it back, but this isn't total war, and Marienburg is far too valuable for anyone to let anyone else take over. It's kind of like a delicately balanced house of cards, only in this case, if someone knocked the cards over, they get dogpiled by everyone else for doing so. If there's anywhere in the world to have a chase scene through market stalls like it's Indiana Jones, it's Marienburg. And with that, the various things that can be counted as the Empire's provinces have come to an end. I hope you've all enjoyed this fake geography lesson. The various cities of fantasy might get their own dedicated episode in the future, and honestly, some cities could get one all to themselves. Altdorf, turns out, is a very fleshed out place. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Reikland to my empire. You aren't the only people here, but you stand out for your greatness. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Seriously, being a Stirlander is awful. There's mention of how Stirlanders rarely leave the province because they're so grimly accepting of the crap hand life dealt them that they don't even bother to leave, and every province around them is grateful for that fact because no one wants them around. Defeating them in Total War as the Vampires isn't a brutal conquest, it's a mercy killing. For God's sake, they heat their ale up. The dwarfs rightly call them insane for that. Someone needs to bring that entire province to task for its sins.